The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the lonely stretch of Highway 95, where a silver sedan pulled over abruptly, its brakes screeching against the gravel shoulder in the rearview mirror. Sarah Martinez's tear-stained face reflected a mixture of desperation and anguish as she clutched a small bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Her hands trembled as she stepped out of the car, the weight of her decision crushing her chest with each step she took toward the roadside. Behind a cluster of desert brush, she spotted fresh tire tracks and an empty water bowl, evidence of another heartless act that had taken place just moments before, not 50 yards away. A confused German Shepherd mix named Max watched intently from behind a large saguaro cactus. His own abandonment still fresh in his mind, the memory of his family's SUV driving away without him, burned in his consciousness, leaving him lost and bewildered in this harsh environment. The sound of a baby's cry pierced the desert silence. Immediately catching Max's attention, his ears perked up as he watched the young woman place the bundle beneath a small mesquite tree, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as she backed away slowly. Unable to tear her eyes from her infant, Sarah's footsteps grew faster as she retreated to her car, her body moving mechanically while her mind screamed in protest. The slam of her car door echoed across the desert landscape, followed by the roar of an engine as she accelerated away. Leaving a cloud of dust in her wake, Max emerged from his hiding spot, drawn by the continued cries of the infant, his own fear and confusion momentarily forgotten. He approached the bundle with cautious determination, his protective instincts overriding his recent trauma. The sun continued its merciless assault as Max settled beside the crying infant, using his body to create a small shadow over the bundle. His keen ears picked up the sound of the baby's distressed whimpers, reminiscent of the puppies he once helped his former family raise. With gentle movements, he positioned himself closer, offering what little comfort he could provide in this moment of shared abandonment. The desert wind carried the fading sound of Sarah's car, now just a distant speck on the horizon, as two abandoned souls found unexpected companionship in their darkest hour. Time seemed to stand still in the desert heat as Max maintained his vigilant watch over the infant. His previous life of comfort and family love seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose as he guarded this tiny human. The baby's cries gradually softened under Max's protective presence, creating an unlikely bond between two castaways. In the distance, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke through the desert silence, but Max remained steadfast, determined not to let this small human suffer the same fate he had endured. Something deep within told him that their shared story was far from over. Officer Elena Rodriguez had seen her fair share of heartbreaking situations during her 15 years with the Arizona Highway Patrol. But nothing could have prepared her for the scene that awaited her response to a trucker's emergency call. Through the heat waves rising from the asphalt, she first spotted what appeared to be a large dog standing guard near the roadside brush. As her patrol car approached, she noticed how the animal remained firmly positioned, neither fleeing nor showing aggression, its behavior striking her as unusually deliberate and protective. Her years of experience told her this was far from a routine highway incident. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of her car door closing, but his eyes remained fixed on her with an almost human-like intelligence. Elena's hand instinctively moved toward her weapon, but something in the animal's demeanor made her pause. The German Shepherd mix's tail gave a slight wag, and he shifted his position just enough to reveal what he had been protecting, a small bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Her heart nearly stopped when she heard the weak cry emanating from beneath the fabric. Time seemed to freeze as she processed the reality of what she was witnessing. A dog, himself likely abandoned, guarding an abandoned infant in the middle of the desert with slow, careful movements. Elena approached the unlikely pair, speaking softly to both the dog and the infant. The temperature gauge in her patrol car had read 103 degrees, and her first concern was the baby's condition after exposure to such extreme heat. To her amazement, as she knelt beside them, she realized the dog had positioned himself perfectly to provide shade throughout what must have been several hours. The infant, though dehydrated and distressed, was alive thanks to this unexpected guardian angel. She immediately radioed for medical support, knowing every minute in these conditions could be critical as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Elena found herself fighting back tears while documenting the scene. The dog, whose worn collar displayed the name Max, remained calm as paramedics arrived, moving aside only when Elena gently assured him the baby would be cared for. Her police training kicked in as she began piecing together the evidence: fresh tire tracks, an abandoned water bowl, and distinctive marks in the gravel that told the story of two separate vehicles stopping at this remote location within a short time of each other. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than a simple case of abandonment. The media would later call it the Desert Guardian miracle, but in that moment, Elena was focused on ensuring both the baby and the dog would survive their ordeal. As she watched the paramedics work, she noticed Max's eyes never leaving the infant, maintaining his vigil even as medical professionals took over. Something about this case struck a deep chord within her. Perhaps it was the pure devotion of an abandoned dog, choosing to protect an abandoned child, or maybe it was the mysterious circumstances surrounding their discovery. Either way, Elena made a silent vow to uncover the truth behind this remarkable story, unaware that her investigation would unravel a web of circumstances far more complex than she could imagine. 24 hours earlier, Sarah Martinez sat in her tiny studio apartment, staring at the mounting bills scattered across her kitchen table. The eviction notice glared at her from beneath an overdue medical bill, while her newborn son, Lucas, slept peacefully in his second-hand crib. The weight of her circumstances pressed down on her like a physical force. No job, no family support, and the father of her child had vanished the moment she announced her pregnancy. The walls of her small living space seemed to close in with each passing moment, her mind racing through increasingly desperate scenarios. The morning news droned on her small TV, featuring a story about another young mother who had surrendered her baby at a safe haven location. Sarah's attention snapped to the screen, her hands unconsciously gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The reporter discussed the state's safe haven law, explaining how mothers could legally surrender newborns at hospitals or fire stations without fear of prosecution. But Sarah's situation was complicated by factors the cheerful news anchor couldn't possibly understand, factors that made walking into any official establishment a terrifying prospect. The threatening messages on her phone served as constant reminders of why she couldn't take that route. In the bathroom mirror, Sarah barely recognized her own reflection. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and her once vibrant face had grown gaunt with worry. The sound of Lucas stirring in his crib sent her heart racing, not with maternal joy, but with a suffocating panic that had been building for weeks. She loved her son with every fiber of her being, but love wasn't enough to protect him from the dangerous web she'd unwittingly woven around them. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone, scrolling through the increasingly menacing messages from people who wanted her silenced. She knew they would find her soon, and the thought of what might happen to Lucas when they did was unbearable. The decision crystallized in her mind like a terrible weight. Feeling both impossible and inevitable at the same time, Sarah spent the night watching Lucas sleep, memorizing every detail of his perfect face. His tiny fingers, the way his chest rose and fell with each peaceful breath. She wrote and rewrote a letter explaining her actions, but each attempt felt hollow and inadequate. How could she possibly justify what she was about to do? The truth was too dangerous to commit to paper, and any explanation would sound like an excuse. In the end, she left the letter unfinished, tucked away in a drawer with her shattered dreams, as the first rays of dawn crept through her window. Sarah packed a small bag with baby supplies and her remaining cash. She dressed Lucas in his warmest clothes, despite the forecast of desert heat, unable to stop herself from taking these last maternal precautions. The drive out of Phoenix felt surreal, each mile marker bringing her closer to a moment she could never take back. She chose Highway 95 precisely because it was remote, hoping someone kind would find Lucas quickly, but not quickly enough for anyone to follow her trail. What she couldn't have known was that her choice of location would intersect with another abandonment, one that would change everything about the fate she had reluctantly chosen for her son. The Desert Valley Medical Center buzzed with activity as news vans lined the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. Officer Elena Rodriguez stood guard outside the pediatric unit, where baby John Doe, as he was currently known, was receiving treatment for dehydration. The story of the abandoned infant and his canine protector had exploded across social media, capturing hearts nationwide. Inside the unit, Max had been granted special permission to stay near the baby. After the hospital staff witnessed his intense distress when they tried to separate them, the sight of a large German Shepherd mix lying calmly beside an incubator had become the symbol of an unlikely miracle in the desert. Elena watched the latest news broadcast on the waiting room television, where reporters speculated wildly about the mother's identity and motives. The security footage they'd gathered from nearby gas stations showed a silver sedan matching the tire tracks at the scene. But the video quality was too poor to make out the license plate. What troubled Elena most was the second set of tire tracks, likely from the vehicle that had abandoned Max. Her instincts told her these two abandonments happening at the same location couldn't be mere coincidence. But proving a connection would be challenging. She'd spent enough years on the force to know that seemingly random events often held hidden patterns waiting to be uncovered by patient investigation. Dr. Maria Chen, the pediatrician in charge of the baby's care, approached Elena with the latest medical report. The infant was approximately 2 weeks old, well-fed, and despite the dangerous exposure to the elements, in relatively good health. Whoever left him made sure he was well-wrapped and placed in shade, Dr. Chen explained, her voice tinged with a mix of professional detachment and personal concern. This doesn't feel like a typical abandonment case. The mother took precautions. She wanted him to be found. Elena nodded, adding this observation to her mental file. The evidence pointed to someone who cared about the child's welfare, but felt they had no other choice. The question was, what could make a mother feel so desperate? In her temporary bed beside the incubator, Max maintained his vigilant watch, his eyes rarely leaving the tiny human he'd chosen to protect. The nurses had begun bringing him food and water. Touched by his unwavering dedication, one of them had already started the paperwork to adopt him, ensuring he would never be abandoned again. The local news had dubbed him the Guardian, and donations were pouring in for both the dog's care and a fund established for the baby. Elena couldn't help but notice how this story of loyalty and protection had struck a deep chord with people, offering a glimpse of pure goodness in an often dark world. Across town, in a cheap motel room, Sarah Martinez watched the same news coverage with trembling hands. The sight of her son, safe in the hospital, brought both relief and crushing guilt. She hadn't expected the dog's presence or the media circus that followed. Every new report increased the chances of someone recognizing her, of the wrong people discovering her location. The burner phone on the bedside table buzzed with another threatening message. They were getting closer. Sarah buried her face in her hands, torn between the desperate desire to reclaim her son and the terrifying knowledge that doing so would put all three of them, herself, Lucas, and now this brave dog, in immediate danger. Time was running out, and she needed to make a decision that would change all their lives forever. In the dimly lit motel room, Sarah's fingers hovered over her burner phone, reading the latest message. "We know you're still in Arizona. Time's running out." Her hands shook as she deleted it, adding it to the growing list of threats she'd received since witnessing something she was never meant to see. 3 months ago, she'd been a regular bank teller, happily preparing for her baby's arrival. Then came that late night at the bank, the suspicious transaction she'd noticed, and the conversation she'd overheard in the parking lot. She'd done the right thing by reporting it, but she hadn't counted on how deep the corruption went, or how far they would go to keep her quiet. Elena Rodriguez sat at her desk, surrounded by papers and surveillance photos. Connecting threads on her investigation board, the silver sedan had been spotted at 3 gas stations between Phoenix and the abandonment site, but always just out of clear camera range. Something about the deliberate nature of the car's movements suggested experience in avoiding detection. A colleague dropped a new file on her desk, the report she'd requested about recent bank fraud investigations in Phoenix. Her eyes widened as she read about a major case that had gone cold when a key witness disappeared. The witness, a pregnant bank teller named Sarah Martinez, had vanished just as the investigation was gaining traction. Elena pulled up Sarah's employee photo, and her breath caught. The grainy gas station footage showed a woman of similar build, a Desert Valley Medical Center. Max had become something of a celebrity. Local news stations ran daily updates about the Desert Guardian and the baby, whom the nurses had begun calling Angel. The dog's unwavering dedication had caught the nation's attention, with offers to adopt both him and the infant pouring in from across the country. But Max remained focused solely on his charge, demonstrating an intelligence and emotional awareness that amazed even veteran hospital staff. During his mandatory walks outside, he would always hurry back as if afraid the baby might disappear in his absence. Dr. Chen had noted that Angel seemed more peaceful when Max was nearby, their bond defying conventional explanation. The investigation into Angel's family history had revealed nothing in missing persons reports or birth records matching his approximate age and description. Elena found this suspicious. In the digital age, disappearing completely required resources and planning. She began cross-referencing bank employees who had left their jobs in the past year with recent birth records when a knock on her office door interrupted her work. A fellow officer handed her a report about an abandoned car found burning in the desert. Roughly 30 miles from where the baby had been found, the vehicle's registration led to a family who had recently reported their dog missing, a German Shepherd mix named Max. Sarah watched the motel parking lot from behind worn curtains, her heart racing at every passing car. The news coverage about Angel and Max was making it harder to stay hidden. Too many people were looking, asking questions. She knew she should leave Arizona entirely, but something kept her here, unable to completely abandon her son. The threats were becoming more specific, mentioning details about Lucas that they couldn't possibly know unless they were watching her. The front desk clerk's lingering looks had started to make her nervous. She needed to move again, but first she had to find a way to warn someone about the danger, not just to herself, but to everyone involved in her son's case. Officer Rodriguez seemed intelligent and trustworthy in her TV interviews, but reaching out to her would be incredibly risky. As Sarah packed her meager belongings, she made a decision that would either save them all or lead to her worst fears being realized. Officer Elena Rodriguez was working late, the office empty except for the quiet hum of her computer. A plain white envelope had appeared on her desk sometime during the day with no indication of its sender. Inside she found a single bank transaction receipt and a hastily scribbled note. The baby's name is Lucas, check account 7428915, April 15th. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the account number from the bank fraud investigation. The handwriting matched samples from Sarah Martinez's personnel file. Elena quickly logged into the police database, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed the bank records. The transaction from April 15th appeared routine at first glance, but something about the routing numbers caught her attention. They matched a pattern used in a series of money laundering cases. At the hospital, an unexpected commotion erupted when Max suddenly became agitated. Growling at the doorway to Angel's room, the night nurse reached for the phone, but before she could call security, she noticed a man in hospital scrubs she didn't recognize trying to slip into the unit. Max's aggressive stance and continuous growling forced the man to retreat, and by the time security arrived, he had vanished. The security footage would later show him driving away in a black SUV with tinted windows, the same vehicle type mentioned in Sarah's police report months ago. Dr. Chen immediately ordered increased security measures. Disturbed by the implications of someone attempting to access the baby's room outside of authorized hours, Max's protective instincts had proven invaluable once again. Sarah's hands trembled as she sealed the last of her evidence into a manila envelope. Bank statements, transaction records, and photographs she'd managed to take before fleeing her job. She had spent months gathering proof of the money laundering operation, watching as millions of dollars moved through seemingly legitimate accounts. The flash drive containing her original report to the bank's compliance officer was her most damning piece of evidence. She knew the corrupt bank executives would do anything to keep this information buried, including harming an innocent baby to flush out a witness. Her decision to leave Lucas had been motivated by more than poverty. It was the only way she could think of to keep him safe while she tried to expose the truth. Elena's investigation had taken on new urgency after the hospital incident. The connection between the bank fraud case and the abandoned baby was becoming clearer, but the scope of the conspiracy was larger than she'd initially suspected. Her research revealed that 3 other potential witnesses in similar cases had experienced mysterious accidents or disappeared entirely. The burning car that had belonged to Max's original family now seemed less like random crime and more like a warning. She needed to move carefully. Corrupt officials could be monitoring her investigation. As she studied the evidence spread across her desk, a security alert popped up on her computer. Someone had tried to access her case files using a senior detective's credentials, but that detective was currently on vacation in Europe. The desert wind howled outside Sarah's new hiding place, a small rental cabin on the outskirts of town. She had chosen this location carefully, close enough to keep watch over her son, but remote enough to spot anyone approaching. The burner phone she'd been using to monitor news about Lucas suddenly chimed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart stopped as she read the message. "We found the envelope you left for Rodriguez last chance. Midnight Gateway Motel or everyone you care about pays the price." Sarah clutched the phone, tears streaming down her face as she realized she was out of options. She couldn't let them hurt Lucas or the people protecting him. But as she prepared to face her enemies, she remembered something from her bank training about setting up silent alarms. Perhaps there was a way to turn their trap into an opportunity. But it would require perfect timing and help from someone she wasn't sure she could trust. The Gateway Motel stood like a neon-lit sentinel on the edge of town, its vacant parking lot shimmering in the desert heat. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, parking her rental car where she could observe all approaches to the building. Her entire body tensed as she spotted Elena Rodriguez's unmarked police car pulling into a spot 2 blocks away. The officer had received her anonymous tip and understood its implications. The manila envelope containing the last pieces of evidence was tucked securely in Sarah's jacket, but its contents had already been digitally transmitted to multiple secure locations. She had learned from her time at the bank that the best insurance policy was redundancy. The midnight deadline approached as Sarah watched 2 black SUVs circle the motel like vultures. At Desert Valley Medical Center, Dr. Chen was completing her final rounds when she noticed something odd about Angel's latest visitor log. The signature for the evening shift change didn't match the usual nurse's handwriting. Max, who had been dozing beside the incubator, suddenly raised his head and fixed his gaze on the unit's entrance. The dog's behavior over the past week had proven eerily prescient, and Dr. Chen had learned to trust his instincts. She quietly pressed the silent alarm under the nurse's station, then positioned herself between the baby and the door. The security upgrade following the previous intrusion attempt included silent alert protocols that would bring help without tipping off potential threats. Elena maintained her position, watching the motel through binoculars as her backup units moved into predetermined locations. The operation had been planned with minimal radio communication to avoid detection by anyone monitoring police frequencies. Her investigation had uncovered a network of corrupt officials, including law enforcement officers, which meant she could only trust a select few colleagues. The evidence Sarah had provided painted a picture of massive financial fraud with tentacles reaching into various government agencies. The attempted break-in at the hospital had confirmed her suspicions that the conspirators were growing desperate. She checked her weapon one last time as the hour approached, knowing that tonight would change everything. Sarah's mind raced through memories of the past year as she waited, discovering the fraudulent transactions, documenting the evidence, realizing she was pregnant, and watching her simple life unravel into chaos. The hardest moment had been leaving Lucas in the desert, but she had chosen that spot specifically because she had seen Max being abandoned there earlier that morning. Something in the dog's loyal eyes had given her hope that her son wouldn't be alone for long. Now, as midnight approached, she gathered her courage for what she knew would be the most dangerous confrontation of her life. The sight of familiar faces emerging from the SUVs confirmed her worst fears about who was really behind the threats. The tension in the air was electric as Sarah stepped out of her car, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. The bank's former vice president, James Morrison, emerged from one of the SUVs, flanked by 2 men she recognized from the night she had overheard their conversation in the parking lot. What they didn't know was that Sarah had planned this moment carefully. The envelope she carried wasn't the only copy of her evidence, and she wasn't as alone as they thought. As Morrison approached with a false smile, Sarah glanced briefly toward Elena's position, giving the signal they had arranged through their coded messages. The next few minutes would determine not just her fate, but the safety of her son and everyone involved in protecting him. James Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached Sarah in the motel parking lot. "Miss Martinez, I'm glad you finally decided to be reasonable," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble." Behind him, his 2 associates spread out in a flanking position, their suit jackets failing to completely conceal their shoulder holsters. Sarah clutched the envelope tighter, her eyes darting between the 3 men as she took a careful step backward. "Trouble," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You mean like the millions in drug money you've been laundering through the bank?" Morrison's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to speak so boldly about what she knew. Simultaneously at Desert Valley Medical Center, Dr. Chen's suspicions proved correct, as two men in hospital scrubs attempted to enter the pediatric unit through the service entrance. Max's low growl became more pronounced as they approached Angel's room. His body positioned protectively between the incubator and the door. The first man pulled out what appeared to be official hospital documentation, but Dr. Chen had already activated the unit's lockdown protocol. Through the security cameras, she could see the hospital's newly installed security team moving into position. The men's increasingly aggressive demands to enter revealed their true intentions, but they didn't realize they had walked into a carefully prepared trap. Elena watched the scene unfolding at the motel through her rifle scope, cataloging faces and matching them to the files she'd compiled. Her team was in position, but timing would be crucial. The evidence Sarah had provided revealed that Morrison wasn't just a corrupt banker. He was the linchpin in a massive criminal enterprise that used the bank to clean money for several criminal organizations. The attempted intimidation of a pregnant bank teller had backfired spectacularly, creating a witness who had spent months meticulously documenting their entire operation. Now, that same witness stood in the parking lot. Buying time as Elena's team moved into their final positions, Sarah's mind flashed back to the moment she had discovered the truth, not just about the money laundering, but about Morrison's connection to a series of mysterious disappearances. Her pregnancy had actually saved her life, making them hesitant to simply eliminate her, as they had done with others. Instead, they had tried to control her through threats, not realizing that every threatening message, every intimidation attempt, had been carefully documented and added to her growing pile of evidence. The manila envelope in her hands was their focus now, but the real evidence was already in motion. Being delivered to multiple law enforcement agencies and news outlets, Morrison took another step forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Give me the envelope, Sarah, and this all goes away. Your son can come home. You can have your life back." The mention of Lucas made Sarah's heart race, but not from fear, from anger. These men had forced her to abandon her baby, had terrorized her for months, had tried to break into the hospital to use him as leverage. She thought of Max, the loyal dog who had become her son's guardian angel, and of all the people who had protected Lucas when she couldn't. Her voice was clear and strong as she replied, "You're right. Mr. Morrison, this does all end tonight." As if on cue, police lights suddenly flooded the parking lot from all directions, and Elena's voice boomed through a megaphone, "Federal agents, freeze!" Chaos erupted in the motel parking lot as Morrison's men reached for their weapons. Sarah dove behind a nearby car as the first shots rang out, the manila envelope still clutched to her chest. Elena's voice cut through the chaos on the megaphone. "Drop your weapons. The building is surrounded." Morrison's face contorted with rage as he realized the extent of the trap he'd walked into. His carefully constructed world of financial fraud and intimidation was crumbling around him, and his instincts shifted from control to survival. He grabbed Sarah's arm as she tried to scramble away, using her as a shield while backing toward his SUV. "Nobody moves or she dies," he shouted, pressing a pistol to her head at Desert Valley Medical Center. The situation was reaching its own critical point. The two fake hospital workers had realized their cover was blown, but instead of retreating, they became more aggressive. "Open this door now," one demanded, pulling out a weapon. Dr. Chen stood her ground, positioning herself between them and Angel's incubator. While Max's growls became more threatening, the dog's posture had changed from defensive to offensive, his training from his previous life as a family protection dog emerging in full force. Security cameras captured everything as hospital security moved in from multiple directions. The intruders were caught in their own trap, too focused on their objective to realize they were now surrounded. Elena watched through her scope as Morrison held Sarah hostage, her finger steady on the trigger. Years of training had prepared her for moments like this, but the stakes had never been higher. Her team held their positions, red dots from their laser sights, creating a deadly constellation around Morrison and his men. Through her earpiece, she received confirmation that the hospital situation was also under control. The second team of corrupt bankers had failed in their attempt to reach Lucas. Everything they had planned for was unfolding, but Morrison's desperate action threatened to unravel it all. She needed a clean shot, but Sarah was too close to the target. Sarah felt the cold metal of Morrison's gun against her temple. But her fear had been replaced by a strange calm. She thought of Lucas, safe in his hospital room with his faithful protector, and of all the other families Morrison and his organization had destroyed. The evidence she'd gathered wasn't just in the envelope. It was scattered across the country, set to be released to multiple agencies by morning. Her son would be safe, whether she survived this night or not. This realization gave her the courage for what she did next. "You know what your mistake was, James," she said quietly, feeling him tense at the use of his first name. "You thought threatening my baby would make me weaker. It made me stronger." In a move that surprised everyone, Sarah suddenly dropped and twisted away from Morrison's grip, years of self-defense classes clicking into place. The envelope went flying, scattering papers into the desert wind. Papers that Elena's team already had copies of. Morrison's moment of confusion as he tracked the flying papers with his eyes gave Elena the clear shot she needed. A single shot rang out, precise and controlled, striking Morrison's shoulder and sending him sprawling backward. His men, seeing their leader fall and realizing they were completely surrounded, finally dropped their weapons. As Sarah was pulled to safety by Elena's team, she could hear police sirens converging from all directions. The night wasn't over yet, but the worst had passed. Her thoughts turned to the hospital, to Lucas, to Max, and to the reunion she had dreamed of every night since making the hardest decision of her life. The pediatric unit at Desert Valley Medical Center was eerily quiet after the chaos of the attempted break-in. Both would-be intruders had been apprehended, their false credentials tracing back to the same criminal organization that had just crumbled in the motel parking lot. Dr. Chen stood by Angel's, Lucas's, incubator, watching the baby sleep peacefully, completely unaware of how many people had fought to protect him tonight. Max hadn't moved from his protective position. Though his posture had relaxed slightly, the dog's ears perked up suddenly, and he turned toward the door with an entirely different demeanor than he had shown the intruders. Moments later, Sarah appeared in the doorway, escorted by Officer Rodriguez. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she approached her son for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Her hands shook as she reached for him, hesitating just inches away, suddenly unsure if she had the right to touch him after what she'd done. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "He's been waiting for you." "They both have." Max's tail wagged as he watched Sarah, as if he had somehow known all along that she would return. The dog moved slightly to make room for her beside the incubator, but maintained his protective stance, now guarding both mother and child. When Sarah finally lifted Lucas into her arms, his eyes opened, and he stared at her with a gaze that seemed to hold no judgment, only recognition. Elena watched the reunion from the doorway, her professional demeanor temporarily cracking as she wiped away a tear. The evidence Sarah had collected over months of careful documentation was already being processed by federal authorities. Morrison's arrest had triggered a cascade of investigations across 3 states, revealing a network of corruption that went far beyond simple money laundering. Sarah's meticulous gathering of evidence, from bank records to recorded threats, had given them everything they needed to dismantle the entire organization. What had started as one pregnant bank teller, noticing suspicious transactions, had evolved into one of the largest financial crime busts in Arizona history. The story of how a mother's desperate choice and a dog's unwavering loyalty had led to the exposure of a massive criminal enterprise was already spreading through news channels. But here in the hospital room, none of that mattered. Sarah sat in a rocking chair holding Lucas close, while Max rested his head on her knee. She told her son everything, about the threats, about her fear, about seeing Max being abandoned that morning and making the split-second decision that had saved all their lives. "I knew he would protect you," she whispered, scratching behind Max's ears. "I saw in his eyes what they had done to him, abandoning him like that, but I also saw his strength just like I had to be strong for you." Dr. Chen updated Lucas's medical records, officially replacing Baby John Doe with his real name, while Elena quietly coordinated with the witness protection team waiting outside. Sarah and Lucas would need to disappear again, but this time with full federal protection and support. Max would go with them. Of course, there was no question about separating them now as dawn approached. Casting long shadows through the hospital windows, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare that had begun with a suspicious bank transaction was finally ending. She looked down at her sleeping son, then at the loyal dog who had saved him, and finally at the dedicated officer who had believed in her evidence. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest acts of love require the most difficult choices, and sometimes those choices lead to unexpected miracles. The small mountain cabin in northern Montana looked nothing like Sarah's previous life in Arizona. Snow blanketed the surrounding forest, creating a peaceful isolation that felt more like protection than confinement. Lucas, now 3 months old, lay on a colorful playmat while Max kept his usual vigil nearby. The dog had adapted beautifully to their new environment, his protective instincts extending to warning them about approaching wildlife. Sarah watched them from the kitchen window as she prepared lunch, still amazed at how dramatically her life had changed in the past month. Cows Marshal Kate Thompson, their primary protection agent, was due for her weekly check-in, bringing news from the ongoing investigation that had expanded far beyond Arizona's borders back in Phoenix. Elena Rodriguez sat in a federal courthouse, preparing to testify about the events that had led to Morrison's arrest. The case had grown exponentially as more evidence emerged. Sarah's careful documentation had exposed connections to similar operations in 12 other banks across 3 states. The prosecution's evidence table was covered with financial records, surveillance photos, and transcripts of threatening messages. A testament to one woman's determination to expose the truth, Eleanor had just learned that 3 other whistleblowers, who had previously disappeared, had been found alive, hidden away by the same organization that had threatened Sarah. Their testimonies would ensure that Morrison and his associates would never see freedom again. Sarah's door chimed with the special sequence that indicated Marshal Thompson's arrival. The agent entered, shaking snow from her boots and immediately greeting Max with the respect he'd earned. "The latest from Phoenix," she announced, setting her briefcase on the kitchen table. "Your evidence didn't just expose the money laundering. It uncovered a network of witness intimidation that spread across the entire Southwest. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is calling it the domino case. One bank teller's discovery toppled an entire criminal empire." Sarah listened while preparing tea, her mind struggling to connect her simple discovery of suspicious transactions to the massive investigation it had triggered. "More importantly," Thompson continued, "all the threats have been neutralized. You and Lucas are safe." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Sarah took Lucas and Max for their daily walk around the cabin's perimeter. The baby was bundled against the mountain chill. Cooing happily at the snow falling around them, Max trotted ahead, creating a path through the fresh snow, occasionally looking back to ensure his family was following safely. Sarah thought about the message Elena had passed along through official channels. The hospital staff who had protected Lucas had received commendations, and Dr. Chen had established new security protocols for infant wards across the state. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Sarah reflected, remembering that first moment when she'd noticed the irregular transactions at her terminal. As evening approached, Sarah sat in the cabin's living room, Lucas sleeping peacefully in his crib while Max maintained his usual protective position nearby. She opened her laptop to continue working on the book she'd been encouraged to write. Not about the criminal case, which was still largely confidential, but about the profound bond between a loyal dog and an abandoned baby. The publisher had already suggested it could help other survivors of witness intimidation find their courage. Marshal Thompson had approved the project, understanding that telling this part of the story could help others while keeping the ongoing investigation's details secure. Sarah typed slowly, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes the greatest acts of love look like abandonment to the outside world, and sometimes, in our darkest moments, salvation comes with 4 paws and an unwavering heart. 6 months after the arrests, the impact of what the media had dubbed the Desert Guardian case continued to ripple through the financial industry. Elena sat in her newly promoted office at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, reviewing reports of banks nationwide implementing enhanced whistleblower protection protocols. Sarah's case had become a landmark example in training sessions for financial institutions, though her identity remained protected. The security footage of Max protecting Lucas had been viewed millions of times, inspiring a nationwide movement to improve child protection laws. On Elena's desk sat a framed photo of Max wearing his newly awarded Medal of Canine Excellence from the American Humane Society, an award accepted on his behalf by Dr. Chen to maintain Sarah's confidentiality. In their mountain sanctuary, Sarah watched Lucas take his first tentative steps, gripping Max's fur for balance as the patient dog walked slowly beside him. The baby's laughter echoed through their cozy home, a sound that still brought tears to her eyes when she remembered those desperate days of separation. Marshall Thompson had become more than just their protector, often joining them for dinner and helping Sarah adapt to their new life. The Marshals' latest visit had brought news that Lucas's story had inspired a new bill in Congress, aimed at providing better protection for financial whistleblowers and their families. Sarah's detailed documentation methods were being incorporated into federal witness protection protocols, creating a blueprint for future cases. Dr. Chen had transformed the pediatric unit's security protocols into a national model for hospital safety. The attempted abduction of Lucas had exposed vulnerabilities in healthcare facilities across the country, leading to a complete overhaul of infant protection systems. She often thought about Max's incredible instincts that night, how his behavior had helped them identify the imposters. Before they could reach Lucas, the Desert Valley Medical Center had even started a therapy dog program inspired by Max's dedication during her occasional secure video calls with Sarah. Dr. Chen would share stories of how their case had changed hospital policies. Though she carefully avoided any details that could compromise their location, the publisher's advance copy of Sarah's book, Guardian Angels Have Paws, sat on her coffee table. Published under a pseudonym with all identifying details carefully altered, the story focused on Max's unwavering protection of Lucas, weaving in themes of loyalty, courage, and the unexpected ways love can manifest in times of crisis. Early reviews praised its emotional depth. While respecting the ongoing confidentiality of the legal case, Marshall Thompson had vetted every word to ensure it couldn't lead back to their location, but the message was clear. Sometimes the bravest choice a mother can make is putting her child's safety above everything, even her own happiness. As the mountain sunset painted their cabin in gold, Sarah worked on her laptop. Responding to carefully anonymized messages from other whistleblowers who had found courage in her story, Lucas played with his blocks on the floor, occasionally reaching up to pat Max's head, a gesture of affection. The dog returned with gentle patience. The sound of Marshall Thompson's car approaching brought them all to attention, Max's ears perking up at the familiar engine sound. Today's visit would bring news about Morrison's sentencing and the latest developments in the expanding investigation. But more importantly, it would bring another evening of shared meals and growing friendship, another small step in building their new life. Sarah looked at her son, healthy and happy, then at the loyal dog who had changed everything, and knew that every difficult choice had led them exactly where they needed to be. 1 year after the desert rescue, the federal courthouse in Phoenix was packed for James Morrison's sentencing. Elena sat in the front row. Representing the task force that had grown from her initial investigation, the case had expanded far beyond money laundering, revealing a decades-long operation that had terrorized whistleblowers across multiple states. Morrison's network had finally crumbled, leading to over 30 high-level arrests and the recovery of billions in laundered funds. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as she delivered the sentence. Multiple life terms with no possibility of parole. Morrison's face remained stone-cold as he was led away, his empire of intimidation and corruption reduced to the sound of chains dragging across courthouse floors. In their mountain home, Sarah watched the news of the sentencing on her secure tablet. Lucas sleeping peacefully in his crib nearby, Max lay at her feet, his graying muzzle the only sign that time was passing. The dog had adapted beautifully to their new life, somehow understanding that their peaceful isolation was a gift rather than a constraint. The book she had written under a pseudonym had become a national bestseller, its message of courage and unexpected guardians resonating with readers worldwide. More importantly, it had inspired a movement for reform in witness protection programs, recognizing the unique challenges faced by whistleblowers with young children. Sarah stroked Max's head, remembering that desperate morning when she had seen him being abandoned, not knowing he would become their salvation. Dr. Chen stood at a medical conference podium, presenting the enhanced security protocols that had emerged from the Desert Guardian case. Without revealing confidential details, she explained how the attempted abduction had exposed critical vulnerabilities in hospital security systems. The video feed showing Max's vigilant protection of Lucas had become a powerful teaching tool, demonstrating the importance of both technological and intuitive security measures. Hospitals across the country had implemented what they called the Guardian Protocol, a comprehensive approach to infant protection that incorporated some of Max's most notable behaviors as security indicators. In the audience, healthcare administrators leaned forward, taking notes on how a single case had revolutionized their approach to patient safety. Marshall Thompson's weekly visits had become a highlight of their secluded life. Today, she brought news that the FBI had created a specialized unit dedicated to protecting financial whistleblowers and their families. Directly inspired by Sarah's case, the unit's training manual included a detailed study of how Sarah had documented the evidence while protecting herself and her unborn child. The Marshal shared another piece of news that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The German Shepherd Rescue Organization that had originally trained Max had received anonymous funding to start a program specifically training dogs to work in hospital pediatric units. The legacy of their story was creating ripples of positive change they had never imagined. As evening settled over their mountain sanctuary, Sarah sat on their porch swing, watching Lucas play in the fenced yard with Max, never far from his side. The boy's innocent laughter mixed with the sound of wind in the pines, creating a melody of peace she had once thought impossible. Her latest secure message from Elena had confirmed that the last of Morrison's network had been dismantled. Their operations exposed by the documentation techniques Sarah had pioneered, the Marshal had hinted that soon they might be able to relax some of the stricter protection protocols, though Sarah had grown to love their mountain solitude. Looking at her son and their faithful guardian, she realized that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, more beautiful one. 18 months after the desert incident, Elena Rodriguez stood before a new class of FBI financial crimes investigators. Using Sarah's case as a template for complex whistleblower protection, the presentation screen behind her showed the famous highway spot where everything began, now marked with a discreet memorial plaque honoring unnamed heroes who changed the system. Without compromising Sarah's security, Elena shared how one person's courage had exposed not just a criminal enterprise, but the flaws in how society protected those who dared to speak up. The case had led to the creation of new witness protection protocols specifically designed for parents with young children, ensuring that no other whistleblower would have to make the same heartbreaking choice Sarah had faced. Lucas celebrated his second birthday in their mountain home, surrounded by the few trusted people who knew their location. Max, ever vigilant but noticeably gentler in his old age, watched the small celebration from his favorite spot near the fireplace. Marshall Thompson had brought a specially approved birthday cake. While Sarah documented every moment with a camera, the photos would never be shared publicly, but they were precious proof that happiness could be rebuilt from the ashes of trauma through the window. Snow fell softly on the mountain landscape that had become their sanctuary, so different from the desert where their journey began. Sarah caught herself remembering that desperate day, amazed at how life's darkest moments could lead to unexpected blessings. Dr. Chen's pediatric security program had expanded to hospitals nationwide. With Max's story serving as its inspiration, the Guardian Protocol had already prevented several attempted abductions, its success rate drawing international attention. Chen kept a special photo in her office, Max wearing his therapy dog certification badge, taken during their last day at Desert Valley Medical Center. The image served as a reminder that sometimes the best security systems aren't built on technology, but on intuition and unwavering loyalty. She had recently been appointed to head a national commission on hospital safety, using lessons learned from Lucas's case to protect other vulnerable patients. Sarah's book had taken on a life of its own, being translated into multiple languages and used in ethics courses at major universities. The story of a mother's impossible choice and a dog's unexpected guardianship had sparked important conversations about corporate whistleblower protection and witness safety. Writing under her protected pseudonym, Sarah had begun work on a second book, this one focusing on helping other survivors rebuild their lives after trauma. Marshall Thompson had cleared each chapter personally, ensuring the message could help others while maintaining their security. The Marshal had become more than their protector. She was now part of their small but precious family circle. The evening found Sarah, Lucas and Max taking their usual walk around their property's secure perimeter. Lucas's small hand gripped her fingers, while his other hand rested confidently on Max's back, the three of them moving in perfect synchronization. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and promise, so different from the desert heat where their story began. Sarah thought about Elena's latest update. The whistleblower protection program she had inspired had already saved 3 other families from similar situations. Looking at her son's happy face and the loyal dog who had changed everything, Sarah realized that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most desperate choices. Their story had become more than just survival. It had become a beacon of hope for others facing impossible decisions. 2 years to the day after the desert incident, Sarah stood at her mountain cabin window, watching Lucas play in the snow with Max. The German shepherd had slowed with age but remained steadfastly devoted to his young charge. Marshal Thompson's latest visit had brought life-changing news. The threat assessment had been lowered enough to allow them limited contact with the outside world. The corrupt network that had forced them into hiding had been completely dismantled, its key players serving long sentences in federal prisons. Morrison's appeal had been denied, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The system Sarah had helped expose was being rebuilt from the ground up, with new protections for those brave enough to speak out. In Phoenix, Elena Rodriguez was being honored with the FBI's highest civilian service award for her role in the case. The ceremony was closed to the press to protect ongoing operations. But Sarah watched via secure video feed, tears flowing as Elena dedicated the award to a brave mother who risked everything to protect not just her child, but the integrity of our financial system. The investigation had led to the recovery of over $3 billion in laundered funds, much of which was being used to establish a new foundation supporting whistleblower protection programs. Eleanor's task force had become the model for similar units across the country, their methods based on the careful documentation Sarah had pioneered during her months of gathering evidence. Dr. Chen stood in the newly renovated pediatric wing of Desert Valley Medical Center, now named the Guardian Angel Ward. The security system she had developed after Lucas's case had been implemented in hospitals worldwide, preventing countless attempted abductions. A beautiful mural adorned the main wall, depicting a German shepherd watching over sleeping infants, a tribute to Max that didn't compromise their security. The therapy dog program she had started had expanded beyond all expectations, with specially trained dogs now working in pediatric wards across the country. Each dog wore a badge inspired by Max's original therapy certification, a small reminder of how one act of loyalty had sparked a revolution in patient care. Sarah's books had created a movement, inspiring others to speak up against corruption while providing a roadmap for rebuilding lives after trauma. She had received countless letters from readers who found courage in her story, all carefully screened and forwarded through Marshal Thompson. The new whistleblower protection protocol she had inspired had already saved dozens of families from similar situations, creating a legacy of safety and justice that would continue long after their story was forgotten. Her latest manuscript, nearly complete on her laptop, focused on the healing power of unexpected guardians. Those moments when help comes from the most surprising sources. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their snowy sanctuary, Sarah called Lucas and Max in for dinner. The boy, now a healthy toddler, ran to her with all the joy of a child who had never known fear. His faithful guardian following close behind, Marshal Thompson would be joining them soon for their weekly dinner, bringing news from the outside world and the warm friendship that had grown from their shared journey. Looking at her small but precious family, her son, their loyal protector, and the close circle of friends who had risked everything to help them, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. Their story had begun in desperate circumstances on a desert highway, but it had evolved into something far more powerful, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unexpected ways love can manifest in our darkest hours. As Lucas hugged Max before settling in for dinner, Sarah realized that sometimes the most beautiful endings grow from the most painful beginnings, and that true guardian angels can come in many forms, even with 4 paws and an unwavering heart.